How am I going to explain this? Langston wondered if he'd gone the wrong way. Sweat trickled from his brow. He fidgeted in his seat while squeezing the steering wheel, barely pressing the gas pedal. He winced every time branches screeched and scraped along the windows. He was pinned in a rental on a narrow red dirt path. Rows of trees created a makeshift dome blotting out most of the sky. Branches and leaves loomed all around him. Branches popped and snapped, the sound muffled under the weight of the huge piece of metal forcing itself through their web. Langston's sweat almost created a puddle. He bet there was more than enough evidence for the rental company to snag his safety deposit. If there were any slight movements in any direction, God knows how he'd even get his car back to Florida. The sides of the roads were like gutters on a bowling lane. He felt like one big bowling ball that could fall into the gutter at any moment. Langston tried not to think about it. He held his breath and focused on an exit that sat like a light at the end of a tunnel just out in front of him. His directions led him to this small hole in a forest just off Highway 29 out in Conecuh County, Alabama. The sign that read Walker Road about a mile back was consumed by foliage, and the path looked as though it hadn't been passed through in ages. Supposedly, it led to a piece of family real estate on their backwoods country property, but Langston was kicking himself. What was he trying to find out in the middle of nowhere? Langston exhaled when the car burst out of the tiny corridor into a small open circle in the trees. Langston pressed harder on the gas, leading the car across a rugged road towards a tiny cottage that sat in the middle of the open land. He gaped at the tiny house from the safety of his car. It was a swamp cabin complete with a front porch. Pieces of it looked old, dark, and rotten, but it was contrasted by brighter, newer wood. Fresh, fake planks of wood formed a prosthetic limb to the right of an older main house that was blackened, weathered, and rotten from time. A line of exposed wire ran up to an installed front porch light through a hole in the front wall of the house. Langston didn't get that feeling of sturdiness or safety that came with modern architecture. He couldn't help but think it was a house made of sticks ready for the big bad wolf to come and blow it all down. He thought Uncle Randy hired professionals to fix up the place and keep the yard trimmed. Uncle Randy had said this place was supposed to be livable, a type of southern cabin in the woods for the family, an heirloom. Langston's family owned several acres of land out in Alabama. Langston's great-uncle and grandmother lived here when they were both young. The second youngest, Uncle Randy, left sooner than Langston's grandmother. Grandma Amy, the youngest of the family, made the trek to Los Angeles in the 60s, and that's where his family remained planted for 2 generations. Unfortunately, Uncle Randy's health was on the decline, and he couldn't keep up with the renovations. Uncle Randy and his grandmother were the last ones standing out of their siblings, so naturally, the passing of the land is handed down to the eldest. And soon, it had passed to Langston's mother's generation, and then to Langston. But none of Langston's siblings or cousins bothered to pick up the task either, all too busy living their best lives. So, Grandma Amy volunteered Langston to check up on the place, and he didn't have much of a say in the matter either. She wanted him to see the land for himself and to connect with his roots. And Langston was looking for his next big idea. He wanted this story to be different, so he accepted his grandmother's call. Langston parked and stepped out of the car, staring at the house he'd be spending the next month in. He thought about turning back and spending the rest of his trip at a hotel. But he bet his Uncle Randy $1,500 that he'd be able to make it for at least 2 weeks. He got double if he made it for the full month. Uncle Randy didn't think the country was in him. Langston was born in the city. According to Uncle Randy, Langston wouldn't know left from right without a smartphone. Uncle Randy's incessant reminders of how little electricity there was rang in Langston's mind. Langston scratched his head and tried to fathom ways to swindle his Uncle Randy out of his money. There was a motel when he passed Evergreen a few miles back, but the hotel would cost money. He was pretty sure all the money he'd be using pretending to be here will ultimately just replace the money he'd already spent. There wouldn't be much return on investment if he did it. It was free to live on his family's land. All he paid for was the rental, gas, and food. Jesus, Langston muttered to himself, looking at the sky. His city boy mind went all comfortable and cozy when Grandma Amy said the house was livable, like somewhere up in Big Bear. But what did he expect out of the crevices of Zaru, Alabama, his family's earliest known origin? Rays of sunshine beamed through the trees, creating a beautiful natural light that seemed to transform as the sun moved down and out of the sky on the western horizon. The sunlight cast an orangish glow that blended with the color of the leaves that were changing as the season went into fall. There was a faint mist that gave the surrounding area a hazy, dreamlike filter with the sunlight. It was humid and warm, the perfect condition to sustain the life around it. Beads of sweat started dripping from Langston's temple, creating that muggy feeling that made a person feel sticky and gross. Langston stretched out wide into the air and spread all the way into his fingers, stiff from being crammed in that compact sedan. The sound of a loud chorus of buzzing and chirping amongst the trees from tiny creatures he couldn't see caught his ear. The open area around him was no bigger than the size of a professional basketball court. The tall trees on the edge were the stands. The front yard was an ankle-high carpet of fall-colored leaves. Large, dismembered tree trunks were spread along the ground. The perimeter was miles of unincorporated forested land. Langston turned and looked down the road he used to enter the woods. It was the only path in and out. Langston turned his attention back to the house. He was a large man, standing well above 6 feet. He wasn't heavy, but he wasn't skinny either. Would he even be able to fit, he thought to himself. He approached the house and made his way up the front porch, being careful of any rotten wood. The tip of his head was a little too close to the cobwebs under the porch, which had a pale bluish-green underbelly resembling the color of the ocean. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old skeleton key, put the key into the lock, and turned it. The door popped open, but got stuck along the ground. Langston put a bit more force into his next push, but it wouldn't budge. He rammed the door with the shoulder he'd used as a defensive end at Dorsey High. It flew open, luckily still on its hinges. A sea of light flooded the house, causing tiny creatures to scutter to the shadows. The room was dark, humid, and damp, with a natural musty aroma of bark. Langston scanned the room as he tiptoed in. It was a simple design of 3 small conjoined rooms. The front consisted of a crude fire pit that sat in the middle of a large wooden box living room. A desk sat along the wall to the left of a door frame that led to the kitchen across from the front door that Langston came through. A wide rectangular window with an old carpet for a curtain sat to Langston's left on the same side of the front door. Wires met at several points in a system of bare light bulbs along the ceiling. Langston entered the front room. A door to the right led to an attached bathroom, which quelled any fears of late-night trips to the outhouse. In the bathroom, there was little room to maneuver, and the shower was one big square tile of ceramic. The toilet was something you'd see in a porta potty or on a plane, like someone took a bathroom from the RV and cut and pasted it onto the house. Langston made his way into the kitchen. It was a thin horizontal rectangle with no cabinets nor a refrigerator, only a thin countertop and an empty food storage box on the floor underneath it. A small wood-powered stove sat on the right. A door with a small wire opening to look outside across from him to his left served as the exit to the back. A thick, green leather maintenance book sat on the counter. Langston picked it up. The faux leather was stretched with an old feel to it, as if someone had used this book more than a handful of times. He opened it and looked through the pages. It was jargon he didn't understand, and some pages even contained post-it notes, but most of the log was empty. Langston put the book down and used the back door. It led to the second half of the treeless circle, a backyard. Anything further was trees as far as the eyes could see. Langston turned around to see the electrical wires meeting at a central point and dragging along the ground to a generator to the left of the back door. Further to the left was a chicken coop missing its ceiling and front wall. It was full of several old, chopped-up wooden logs. He walked over to the generator, grabbed the cable, and planted himself and let it rip. Nothing happened at first, but on the ninth try or so, the generator roared to life. It sent a wave of sound rippling throughout the peaceful woods. The wildlife scattered at its unnatural echo. The generator's hoarse hum grew to a healthy, stable flow of power as the engine warmed up. A small bird dove from the sky and perched itself onto the house just above the back door. Langston stopped and looked at the bird. It had a long bill with a crest at the back of its head. Its feathers were the color of a dark, overcast sky, and it had black, beady eyes. It wasn't a bird Langston had ever seen, but then again, he'd never been outside of California. He didn't study birds. Langston continued his return to the house. He kept looking back at the bird as he trailed forward. It was staring at him. Could birds stare, Langston thought, as it tracked his movements? With intent, no less? It jumped off the back door and flew away over Langston's head as if sensing Langston's awareness. The bird's shadow running over his body sent a shiver down his spine. Langston returned to the car and popped open the trunk, from which he retrieved an arsenal of supplies, mothballs, insecticides, snake repellent, the works. The thought of something tickling his face in the middle of the night spurred him to an absolute cleaning frenzy. Grandma Amy gave him the game on how to spruce up the place. He cleaned with a militaristic diligence to beat the sun. He swept the floors, in between, over and under all the cracks and crevices of the front room with the use of a high-powered flashlight. He hosed down cobwebs of entire families of spiders off the window curtains with a can of Raid like it was a flamethrower. He removed the centipedes that found their way into the home. He let all the critters with wings outside and plugged every hole he could find. The final boss was a snake found near the chicken coop out back. He beat it to death with a long tree branch from a distance. By the time the sun set, Langston had faced fears he never thought he had of creatures a fraction of his size. He rooted out every trespasser he could find and made sure to replace their presence with traps. Finished, Langston smoked a joint outside on the front porch while the house aired out from its destruction. The sun fell behind the trees. A bare bulb for a front porch light created a small, thin halo of light around the house. It felt like a safe haven from the rest of the woods. Outside of the small perimeter of light, everything was black. The creatures hidden among the trees grew louder as they sang in unison, as if celebrating the falling of the sun. Langston stared into the darkness, pondering what the next month would be like. He was alone and stranded, the only human being for miles. The nearest town was about an hour drive, and the road the house was on was secluded in a swamp. Things were different without the comfort of the city. The city, where just about every corner was lit and catered to, was different from the backwoods of the South. Some areas of land were untouched. Unless someone gave a damn to update anything, it stayed that way. When there aren't any streetlights to guide you at night, you realize just how sheltered the city can make a person, Langston thought. He forced himself down the steps of the front porch, joint in hand, step by step. Each step waned at reserves of courage until he stood just outside the porch's small halo of light. It felt like a shield from the vast unknown, except there was no wall to keep anything out. He looked up. There were a ton of tiny white dots scattered throughout the sky, more than he'd ever seen in the city. He guessed the country had perks in some ways, until a snap of a wrench from the darkness made him pack up the rest of his courage and head up the front porch back into the house. The last thing he unpacked was a tiny 9mm handgun that he owned and kept close. He may have been from the city, but Grandma Amy didn't raise a fool. He was a black man traveling halfway across the country through the heart of the Deep South alone. He wasn't about to end up as a poster child for some new unsolved mystery. He kept the lights on that night and hugged the handgun like a teddy bear. He slept on a blow-up mattress, laying there for hours before managing to stumble into a good hour and a half of solid sleep. Every slight crack or pop from the house ripped him out of the small moments of slumber he could find. Relief came at the first crack of dawn, as soon as the sunlight touched his face. Langston molded his morning routine to suit his environment. He blasted Down Home Blues loud enough to make him feel some normalcy off a portable speaker. He took his morning piss in a quick, cramped shower. He went out back and snagged a few logs from the chicken coop and struggled with lighting a respectable fire in the stove furnace. He had to get over his fear of sticking his hand in the oven first. So he spent several minutes after passing it over with his phone's light to see if anything was in there, like a tarantula ready to crawl out and bite off his hand. He ended up using the poker for the fire pit to poke the fire in the stove to life. Langston made a lackluster breakfast of roasted hot dog from over the fire pit, and then took out his Mac and a manuscript covered in red, blue, and green scrawlings. Langston's publication was expecting a new draft next month, but he hadn't even started yet. Langston was used to telling other people's stories, being hired by producers to write the films, but now he somehow managed to get his agent to take a chance on an original concept. As for what that was, not even Langston knew, but now the agent wants to know. Every idea he could think of, someone had done it before, so he needed to find something new. He knew he wanted to write something close to home. His solution? A 1-month stay in the wilderness away from the hustle and bustle in the city. He was writing a story inspired by Grandma Amy, and what better way to get intuitive inspiration than to be the first to stay in his family's newly rented cabin in the woods. Langston had to admit it to himself. He was actually running on pride and a chance at $3,000 from Uncle Randy. The peace and calm of the wilderness did its job. His fingers flew across the keyboard, dumping words onto the page. He wrote in small clusters, about 30 minutes to an hour, then took breaks and strolled around the perimeter of the land, exploring the area to pass the time. There wasn't much to explore. Sometimes Langston would pull up a chair on the front porch and admire the stillness of the land. It made for great scenery for getting high. He watched the trees sway along with the wind. The nearby swamp somehow made the temperature, for lack of a better word, perfect. Nature was happening all around him, but time seemed to stop. The trees blocked the outside world like a force field. The only thing that seemed to matter here was nature and survival. Langston would continue writing until the nighttime, and when the darkness came, he would head to bed and rush into the next day. He managed to turn off the lights after the first 3 nights. Wake up, breakfast, write, explore, write, dinner, sleep. This was the routine Langston fell into. His spark dimmed fast. Boredom consumed him during his adventure. There wasn't much to see anymore. He'd seen it all. The lack of stimulation bled into his writing. Writer's block set in, and he was ripping words from his mind one at a time. He struggled with the second act of his manuscript. One evening, he ended up taking a look at the construction log that he'd found in the kitchen while he smoked on the front porch. At first, the construction was going as planned, but this construction site was caught by a massive lightning storm that interfered with the work. There was a significant drop in personnel. The site had 20 bodies manning the operation on page 1, but that number had dropped to 1. There was a note on the last page. I can't get guys to stick. They get too spooked. I came to the site today and no one was working. I called Ben. He said the guys think this place is too much of a headache to repair. I can't do this alone. But I've tried over and over to get people to close this one out, but even the toughest of them just pack their shit up and leave. Every time I hunt one of them down, I can't get a respectable answer. It's always a storm or someone's superstition getting the better of them. Happy to give a full refund, but this project is a no-go. I can't sit around here babysitting grown men. I have a business to run. Langston checked the date on the entry. 2017. This book sat here for an entire year and no one managed to get the word back to Langston's family. It must have been divine timing that he showed up when he did. His family never received their refund. The book would be great proof in court. Maybe there'd be more than $3,000 waiting at the end of this. A finder's fee, perhaps? Langston picked up his phone and decided to dial Uncle Randy. "Hello?" Uncle Randy said on the other end. Langston cleared his throat. "Hey, Uncle Randy. Who is this?" "It's Langston." "Langston? Oh, Langston. You about ready to come back?" "Nah, not yet. You still owe me $3,000 like we agreed. If you can make it the whole month. I'm surprised you was able to make it past the night." Langston pitched the meat of the forehead in between his eyes, phone perched to his ears. "It's not that scary. Just make sure you got the money, man." "How'd it look? Show me the video like you did last time," Uncle Randy asked. Who did you hire to fix this place? This shit is not stable. I'm waiting on the big bad wolf out here." "What you mean?" Uncle Randy said. Langston explained to Uncle Randy the ledger that he'd found. He even told him about the notes. There was a brief pause in Uncle Randy's response. "So, when do we get the refund? You know I get a piece of that, right?" "We ain't gonna get no refund," Uncle Randy responded. "Unc, I can get you a refund, trust me," Langston said. "I shouldn't have expected anyone to want to go back there," Uncle Randy said. That was not the answer Langston was expecting. His heart skipped a beat. His uncle was a jokester and was a damn good one, but Langston would usually be able to tell by his tone. But Uncle Randy's tone didn't cover up for him. "Yeah, I would have thought the town would have been let that go." "Let go of what, Unc?" Langston responded. "Nothing. It's nothing. It's just that the people around them parts are superstitious is all. They say an old witch doctor cast an evil spirit to roam the woods there. Haints is what they called him," Uncle Randy explained. "So you believe them?" Langston asked. There was another pause. "No, it's just a fairy tale," Uncle Randy said. "So are you going to call your lawyers?" Langston said. "Yeah, I guess I have to." Langston and Uncle Randy drafted up a plan to get their money back for the repairs. Langston even convinced Uncle Randy to give him a finder's fee. Langston stroked his chin like a mastermind and looked out into the woods from the front porch. Two small calico kittens playing with each other danced out of the woods and into view. The mother, a larger calico, came out next to them with a watchful eye on the front porch. Nestled close was an all-black kitten with white fur at the end of his paws that looked as though he were wearing white socks. Langston stood up from his chair. All of them jumped and stared at him when he tried to call them over with a whistle. They stared back, making sure not to move a muscle. Langston had a soft spot for strays out in the cold world. He'd seen enough roadkill on his way here to know where they could end up. And he'd hate for the one with the socks to end up flattened in the middle of the road. But Mama Cat stared him down. Langston had no peace offering. The group broke the standoff, tucked tail, and ran out into the woods, assuming it was the better option. The thought of a predator lurking in those woods gave Langston anxiety. Langston cooked a little extra that day. He set a bowl outside and checked every hour or so to make sure unwanted guests weren't eating the cat's food. He could use a bit of company. All that was waiting for him was a Word document. Langston kept the front porch light on as a beacon of hope for the cats at night, hoping they'd see the light and take shelter. Langston woke up one morning to a dead mouse while the cats were chowing down on a breakfast meal he'd set up for them a day earlier. There was one less calico present. As the days went on, Langston caught himself staring at a page with only the word "the" written on it. Then the light bulb flipped on. The tall trees felt like nature's natural caution tape screaming to keep out. But the truth was, this small circle was only a fraction of the property his family owned. There were no fences, no gates, or park patrol. It wasn't as if he stepped out into those woods, there would be red flashing lights or an instant transmission back to where he started like in a video game. These were his woods, and if Langston was a brave soul, which he thought he was, he'd traverse his woods with no problem. The idea was infected by thoughts of bobcats, rabid deer, snakes, and spiders. What if he got lost and couldn't find his way back? What if a storm arrived? What if? Langston's mind raced with all the possibilities of what could go wrong. He stared at the empty page and made his decision. He'd hike the woods for about a mile or two and then call it quits and head back. For inspiration's sake. He could even make a day of it. Take a break from writing and come back refreshed. After all, he was running with a fever from going stir crazy. Langston spent the rest of the day mulling over whether or not he wanted to follow through. The next day, Langston dressed in high-top shoes, wore layers, and stuffed first aid supplies into a small backpack. He went out to the backyard and pushed through the invisible barrier. The forest was dense and unorganized. Nature as raw as it could get. There was no path, and the dirt was covered by brown leaves mixed with fallen tree branches that made the hike more treacherous than Langston had expected. Trees loomed over him in all directions. Things fell from the sky at random. He tried his best to walk in one direction by etching markers with a knife every 15 minutes. Nature without a human filter was grosser than he imagined. In just a few minutes of walking, he stepped in animal shit and saw more than enough carcasses overrun by fungus, maggots, or both. He was on the brink of turning back when he came nose to nose with a wide banana spider sitting in a thin web. Langston hated spiders, and Alabama was filled with them. Snakes, rats, hell, even a damn bobcat. But spiders, those were a hell no. He considered himself traumatized since he was bitten by a brown recluse as a toddler. He wandered for about an hour south until he came across a behemoth of a tree toppled over along with others it taken along with it. Langston traced the broken trunk to its source. Its stump was several feet away from the rest, a mess of large, sharp splinters of wood. A blackened gash sliced right down the middle of what remained connected to the planted roots. The surrounding area was unscathed. Langston's mind conjured an explanation of how a lightning bolt of the right voltage could strike such a large tree and blow it to pieces. Must have been one hell of a lightning bolt, Langston thought. He pulled out his knife and stabbed an X on the toppled giant. A decline behind the tree led to a narrow river that flowed at a consistent mellow speed from an unknown source, cutting the area into two distinct halves. On the other side, the greenery continued for a few feet before it faded out to a dull brown emptiness. Langston hopped the river and passed into the section of dead trees which, like the rest of the forest, seemed endless. The noise from the insects in the river became distant, replaced by the sound of wind and the occasional bellowing of crows overhead. The lack of sound made him feel he was traversing a sea of death. The thoughts of turning back continued to pop in his mind, but he convinced himself to push forward another few feet. His persistence was rewarded when he saw a dark silhouette of a structure in the distance. Langston mustered up the courage to get closer. Butterflies took over his stomach as he found himself face to face with an old church. It reminded him of Grandma Amy's house, shoddy, rudimentary, and riddled with human error. However, unlike Grandma Amy's home, for which there was an attempt to update, this church was forsaken. All the tall rectangular window panes on the sides of the building were blown out. There were enough burn marks to connect the dots. It was a church. The only indication was a bronze cross tilted to its side over the front entrance. It was one of those old Southern Baptist churches like in movies about the former enslaved people in the South. The sides of the roof converged at the top where another cross stood tall and well placed, looming. The entrance was blown open, inviting anyone to come in. Langston approached the church and peered into its walls through the doorway. The pews sat alone and unattended. Light from a part of the roof that caved in leaked on an isolated podium that overlooked the empty crowd. The only light was from the broken windows and hole in the roof. Langston approached the church and waved his hand in the entrance to clear any invisible webs. He peeked his head through the door first, then his body followed once the entrance was cleared. The church was planted into the earth it stood on, time out in the woods making it a permanent fixture. Foliage leaked in from the outside. It was as if the church itself had grown and rotted in this very spot. Most of the woods was past the point of rotting and sat like a broken image of what it should be. Langston wondered what kind of small congregation would meet out in the woods like this. However, whoever it was either moved on or forgot about this place. But why? Langston made out the outline of a door in the shadows along the back walls behind the podium as he walked up the aisle. Langston hopped on the stage and went for the door, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up as he reached for the doorknob, like a thin spider web had tickled the nape of his neck. Langston looked towards the pews. He thought he caught glimpses of silhouettes out of the corner of his eyes watching him, but they were as empty as he found them. Langston shook off his imagination and twisted the knob. "Holy shit!" Langston said as he tumbled backwards out of the room he burst into. The light from a busted-out window pane to the right of the room illuminated the empty socket holes of a dust-colored skeleton, jaw twisted and hanging loose. Tendons, ligaments, flesh, and muscle all gone God knows how long ago. It sat at a master desk in what looked to be a small office. It just sat behind the desk and did nothing. This was the first time Langston had been face to face with a corpse in this fashion. Should he call the police? But what good would that do? He was out in the middle of nowhere. Jackpot, Langston thought. His expression transformed from fear to a mischievous grin. He'd been the first and only person to discover this place. He could tell the world anything, damn it be the truth or a lie. He whipped out his phone and snapped away, flash on, respect off. He caught the essence of the place in the 20 or so photos he stole. Langston got a wide shot of the room and then moved in for close-ups. There was a bookcase that covered half of the wall behind the desk of the corpse. Most of the books were old textbook volumes for general education, the ones that you put in storage or hang as space fillers. Langston had a few of those. But he did manage to fish out the first edition copy of The New Negro, an Interpretation, and Harlem, Mecca of the New Negro. He tucked the two copies in his backpack and checked them out for good. A globe sat in the back left corner of the room opposite the bookcase. Atop the weathered desk sat a nameplate that read, Dr. Reverend Hiram Simmons. A Bachelor of Science in Education sat dated back to 1928 from Fisk University, hung on the wall across from the busted window pane. It was in the middle of a line of old photos of several brothers under the sewn flag with the Greek letters Alpha Phi Alpha. The skeleton was slumped in a weathered suit. A small red flannel sack hung around its neck like a necklace. The flannel was pristine, unlike the human remains. It could have been the newest thing in a 3-mile radius. The flannel stripes stuck out into the foreground of everything around. The red and gold attracted all of the sunlight in the room, causing it to glow. Langston removed the red flannel necklace from the skeleton. He rolled it in his palm and then squeezed it. "Ah!" he shouted. He winced and let go of the bag, but it stuck to his palm, so he turned his hand over. Something in the bag had pierced through his skin and dug into the meaty part of his palm below his thumb. He pulled it out, leaving a small trickling of blood running from his hand over his wrist and onto the floor. The culprit was a small rusted sewing needle sticking out from the bag, blood dripping from it. Annoyed, Langston tugged at the golden knot holding the red flannel bag together. He held back his body's natural instinct to gag as the knot came loose. The smell reminded him of a sour, dry-aged loogie. He dumped the contents onto the desk. There was the needle that attacked him, dirt, some kind of root, the skull of a baby bird, a rabbit's foot, and a bone of an unknown source. Langston spotted the skeleton's hand atop a leather book as he scanned the items. "You don't mind, do you?" Langston asked. He waited for a second in silence. Didn't think so. Langston lunged over the corpse and snatched the book off the desk. He thumbed through the pages. Water had smeared most of the ink, but there were enough intelligible words for some entertainment. A tickling along his hand caught his attention while reading one of the passages. A juicy spider crawled from under the book onto the pages. Langston jumped back and threw the book on the floor. The spider crawled on top of the leather book and sat there. Langston swept the spider off with his foot and chased after it as it scurried to the shadows. He dashed ahead and stomped out the spider, leaving a splatter of unknown goo. Langston wiped the bottom of his shoe on the floor and picked up the book, dusted it off, and double-checked the pages. He'd had enough of this place. Langston exited the church through the blown-out window from the office. He circled around to the front of the church to catch a wide shot with his phone. He caught a photo of the church in its derelict glory. Then he flipped the camera on selfie mode and aimed it at himself. Hey all, I'm out here in Alabama right now. Hey all, I'm out here in Alabama right now, and I decided to go on a hike on my family's property, and look what I found. Langston explained in his vlog how he found the place, repeating his journey on camera. He did a few takes before being satisfied. After he'd finished the video, he shoved his phone back in his pocket and turned to take his leave. Langston didn't notice at first until he bellowed out a cracked, high-pitched caw. A bird was sitting on top of the brass cross on the top of the church. The cry rang throughout the still air, disturbing the silence. The bird peered at Langston, leaning in with his tail upwards like a dog at attention. A sharp sensation shot through Langston's gut when he realized that the bird was the same as before. The bird continued with one high-pitched screech after the next. Langston, with a growing ache of shame, chose to ignore the bird. He turned around to press forth on his return home. Langston knew his way back. He'd walked in a straight line the entire time, so returning was as easy as pulling a full 180-degree turn. The markers he'd placed kept him on course. The bird's cries faded into the distance after a while. The sun reached the western horizon and the forest became an orange dome, no longer the green environment from earlier. There was a small hint of relief upon seeing the tiny Frankenstein frame of the home in its backyard, but the relief was dulled by the fact that it wasn't Langston's real home. The hairs on his body never quite settled and the goosebumps riddled his skin. He'd been looking over his shoulder the entire walk back. Langston locked himself in, took a shower to rid himself of the essence of his strange journey. The area surrounding his puncture darkened. He doused it in an antiseptic. It didn't sting as much as he thought it should have. He dumped his haul out onto the desk next to the kitchen. He placed the 2 books in his suitcase like hidden treasures and left the leather notebook out for further reading. He went to bed early that night, exhausted from his journey. Creaking wood from inside the house echoed to Langston from reality. His eyes opened, struggling to adjust to the dark. Langston tried to sit up, but he couldn't move. Dazed and drunk from being ripped from his sleep, his body was pinned to the bed. His heart raced as he saw several dark silhouettes hovering over him in the room. There were other figures posted throughout the house. Langston wanted to scream and call out, but his voice remained silent. He was a deer lying on a silver platter. It was like waking up mid-operation. In his mind, he struggled as hard as he could, but nothing came. His heart leapt out of his chest and sweat trickled down his brow. One of the silhouettes walked towards him and leaned in close, but he couldn't turn his head to look away from hollow black sockets. Langston was released from his petrification, and immediately he howled and shot up. He looked around. Daylight was dim, but the light from the sun was apparent. The room was well illuminated, and everything was normal. There were no phantoms in the night. This was the first time he'd experienced such a thing. He shook at how real the sensation felt. A small drop of water landed on his forehead. He looked up. Another droplet smacked him, and he winced. He was still a bit sensitive from his dream. Langston got out of the bed and headed for the front porch. He looked out at the land from under the porch. The clouds were overcast for the first time since he'd gotten here. A row of dark gray fluff that knew no bounds. He could feel the wind pick up, and he was pelted with droplets. It must have been a summer rainstorm. His guess was that it wasn't all too uncommon, even back in the city, even in the desert. The distant roar of thunder caught Langston off guard. He didn't recall any lightning rods in the nearby area. Then he thought of all the marks on the generator. The lightning sounded a bit in the distance. He hoped it'd stay that way. He remembered ceasing all operations once the rain hit as a kid. This wasn't so prevalent out in the city since there wasn't much rain, and it wasn't as harsh either. His grandparents would still turn just about everything off and unplug anything hooked into the walls, then lie down until the rain passed. An odd tradition, Langston thought. Grandma Amy always teased him by threatening that a large bird who controlled the storms would come and take him away from her if he didn't listen. That myth scared him as a child, and Grandma Amy even claimed to have seen this shadow bird in the storm. There was a sinking in his stomach when he realized it must have been in this very house. But Langston was less superstitious than Grandma Amy and didn't believe in Bigfoot with wings. It was more akin to enjoying the rain for Langston, and he suspected that this was the same for his grandparents. They would always spout on and on about letting God do his work by yielding to Mother Nature and so forth. Langston just enjoyed the sound of the rain as it trickled down. As poetic and spiritual as that may have seemed, Langston was slow to get going that morning. His body was sore from the previous day's adventure, and his right hand a tad bit tender. But with this newfound inspiration, he forced himself through the pain. The rain grew and bore down on the tiny home in quadrillions of thick, heavy droplets of southern rain, not the sprinkles like in California. The raindrops created an endless vibration of white noise from falling at a constant speed. The sound felt both soothing and ominous. Langston could hear the sounds of nature's not even a day ago, the swaying of the trees and the songs of the creatures within them. Now, it was an endless hum of water crashing down in the background, replacing all sounds of life. A few times, Langston sprinted in and out of the rain to the chicken coop to retrieve wood from the backyard. He dried himself off and got a fire to a steady rhythm in the fire pit. He spent the day at the keyboard until he hit 40,000 words. Langston ended his session with a sharp migraine. The room spun as he got up from the desk and strode over to his bed just across from the table. He felt his breathing growing ragged, and his head felt like it was about to split open. He found a comfortable position on his blow-up mattress. Any movement caused his head to throb. He faded out of consciousness. A booming crash of thunder made Langston shoot awake. He sat up. The world turned, making him feel queasy. The transition from horizontal to vertical too fast made him lightheaded. He felt around the room and spun, and he tried to figure out if he was asleep or awake. Eventually, the world settled with a soft throbbing in his head. He looked around the room. He was awake, but the sun had retreated behind the horizon. He fumbled around for his phone to discover it was past midnight, that he'd been sleeping since late afternoon. It was pitch black, and the fire dead from not being tended to. Langston rolled out of bed, his head still making him feel as though he were on the verge of throwing up. He placed several logs sitting across the bed into the fire pit and started a fire. Its warm glow grew brighter as Langston fanned the flames with a cardboard sheet and poked at it. When Langston finished, Langston stepped out onto the porch and overlooked the land. Leaves and branches molded into one pulse during the brief strobes of lightning. The single road he used as both entrance and exit looked closed for business. The branches came alive and danced with the wind. Langston swore he saw a black mass standing in the middle of the road during the series of lightning. It looked like the size of a human, but the blackness didn't mold into human features. The trees made it hard to see, so Langston squinted hard, but before he could make the figure out, the lights cut to black. Langston stood on the porch for a while and waited for the lightning to strike again, but it didn't come back. The trees made all kinds of shapes in the night. The nerves from the storm must have caused them to see things, Langston thought. Langston returned to the shack and snuggled into a pallet on his mattress, remembering the occasional blackouts as a child. He entertained himself with a flashlight, his hands in the shadows. The fire provided an uneven, flickering replacement for a flashlight. He put his index and pinky finger up while his other 3 fingers pinched and protruded out and touched one another. The shadow cast on the wall looked like a familiar magazine logo. Langston got bored after dancing the rabbit along the walls for 2 seconds. He turned over and prepared to go back to sleep, but his eyes shot back open as he remembered the leather notebook of Dr. Simmons. Langston grabbed the book from his desk, returned to his bed, and thumbed through it. The notebook's ink was smeared across a few passages, a man's memories erased, Langston thought. He found his first decent sizable chunk to read. Into Miss Clara Belco today while downtown. She looked as beautiful as I remember her in our time in the classroom. One of the many regrets that I have is leaving this town for 4 years, not knowing whether or not she made it out. When I heard about her brother's tragedy, it's a shame. Clara was just as capable as myself. She would have loved what the world contained outside of this forested prison. I have a deep, searing rage that I left her here with that jackass John Walker. The man's been reduced to a champion drunk, a brute at that. If it wasn't for his father, he would be kept away from us all in a jail cell. I shuddered at the thought of the things she'd have to deal with during the years. She invited me to Sunday service. Although I insisted I'm not much one for religion, she convinced me otherwise. She'd even invited me for dinner. But Mr. Walker didn't seem too thrilled about that one. Whatever happens, I will say that my time in Old Zaru hasn't been entirely doom-filled. The rest of the pages became a blur as Langston dozed off. The world faded to black. When Langston woke up the next morning, the house was cold, dark, and unwelcoming. The wood was beginning to falter under such heavy and intense rain, the leaks becoming numerous and more apparent. Langston checked the front porch once again. The rain continued to fall at a steady rate, and there were no signs of slowing down. The sun was up, but instead of the orange hue and dewy green mist, the morning was cold and wet. A gray overcast, a bleak sight. Puddles of indiscernible depth were scattered about, and branches ripped from the trees were spread across the ground. Black burns branded the surrounding trees from the relentless lightning. Some even turned into splinters. Langston observed what was once a peaceful array of nature, now a cold, depressing backdrop. He looked to his right side, where the cats had taken permanent residence on the porch to shelter themselves from the storm. They tolerated his presence, all stranded together. Langston returned inside. He squeezed into the shower and washed himself. He managed to cook himself a semblance of a breakfast with what little rations he had left. Then he returned to the keyboard. His writing kept him in an almost meditative state that allowed him to ignore most of what was going on. Against his better judgment, and tired of having to start fires in the pit and run in and out of the rain, he turned on the lights to the house. A flash and a loud pop towards the back of the house ripped through Blind Willie Johnson's moaning and pulled him away from his trance. The house fell into complete darkness. Langston removed his earbuds, just as the sky clapped, causing him to cover his ears. He sprang up from the desk and rushed to the back door and peered at the generator through the makeshift wire back door window. Langston was just in time to watch a small fire being doused by the rain. Langston opened the back door as a black cloud erupted from the generator. Another lightning bolt stabbed the generator one final time, delivering a death blow that caused it to pop, sparks flung in all directions like fireworks. Langston ducked, retreated inside, and slammed the door shut. The generator sat there like a dead brick. Langston crawled his way back into the living area. He fumbled around the room for his phone, turned on his phone light, and used it to start a fire. Langston sat at his desk and stared at his laptop. The room was illuminated by a gloomy campfire. He called his session early to preserve his battery with the generator out. He needed to run out to town once the storm cleared to see what he could do. He decided to use the rest of the daylight to peruse the life of Hiram Simmons. Langston caught up with where he'd left off. Although Langston enjoyed being in the mind of another human being, he found himself bored with the ramblings of a failed intellectual. Hiram Simmons came off as a man trapped in his own mind. Langston cringed at the way Simmons would turn into Romeo at any mention of his dear darling Clara. It was obsessive and a bit delusional at times. That weird nice guy act, it was strong with this guy. You could never tell if Simmons was the good guy or the bad guy in this story, but Langston had to give it to the man. He was ambitious and with good intentions, but he was an asshole. Langston almost gave up wanting to dig any further. He wasn't into romance and tragedy. The thoughts of Hiram Simmons matched the weather outside. But a brief passage caught Langston's attention. The bird was odd. It kept its beady black eyes on me the entire time that old hag spoke her nonsense. The oddness to that bird still sends shivers down my spine. It matched the air that woman gave off, that of a fiend with two different set of eyes. She had the audacity to step into my church and offer me silly tricks and old Negro superstition. If there's one thing I hate most about these Negroes, these old Negroes, it's that incessant belief that should have died on the plantations. The old woman reeked of it. These old folks still believe in haints and magic. I'm embarrassed to say that I come from this backwards town. She left a red flannel bag as a parting gift and instructed me to douse the thing with whiskey. As if this thing has the power to fill my pews. I wish it were that simple. Clara gave birth to a baby girl. I couldn't bring myself to visit the thing. Everyone knows what John did to her. How could she forgive him? She would never sleep with that man. She stopped coming to Sunday service. Her popularity did wonders for attendance. Now on Sundays, I find myself at my own study. Haints. The words conjured up memories of stories Langston's grandmother would tell him about spirits. His great-grandmother used to see her brother out in the woods. Langston chuckled to himself. A horrid thud from the roof cut through the sound of the rain. Langston sat up in his pallet and listened. A knot twisted in his stomach. It was dusk. Creaking of the wood came from the ceiling, subtle, careful. It could have been the wind or the rain, but the sound of the soft yielding wood was consistent with something tiptoeing along the roof. Langston held his breath. His heart was pounding in his chest, creating a rhythmic, organic bass of panic inside his head. Langston's eyes shot towards the pistol sitting on the floor beside the bed. He snatched it and held it close to his gut, hoping the feeling of the steel would cause the butterflies in his stomach to sink away. What kind of animal would be stalking around at this time of night, in this kind of weather? The sound of a loud splash ripped him away from his thoughts and shoved him back into reality. Whatever was on the roof, it landed just outside the front porch. Langston continued to listen. Soft splashes of wet dirt puddles were faint but apparent. It blended into the sound of the rain and intermittent thunder. Fear planted him on this bed, where he gripped the gun tight against his stomach, butterflies begging to be freed. Those were agonizing seconds that felt like hours. A shrill, blood-curdling wail pierced through it all as lightning struck the roof of the house, causing a loud pop followed by a roar of nature. Several feral cries followed. Langston could hear his new best friends in nature's death match against some unknown predator, and from what he could hear, it was one-sided. Langston bolted from the front door from his bedside. He turned the locks and yanked the door open. He was greeted by a dark purple cloud-filled night sky. The forest silhouette lurked in the background. The front porch was empty. He felt the slick wetness between his toes. He hobbled back inside and grabbed his phone and shined his phone's flashlight towards his foot. His pearl white socks were now soaked in deep red. Do you enjoy scary stories? Check out our podcast, The Blue Porch Presents, where we upload original horror stories monthly. These are original stories independently produced by The Blue Porch, and you can get a physical copy online on Amazon Kindle. Support The Blue Porch by getting yourself a physical or digital copy of all of our stories for as little as $2.99 and be on the lookout for new releases in the future. Thank you.